Boker Tov, good morning everyone. I'm Raz Zimmt. I'm an Iran specialist at INSS. We can't deal with Iran today without talking about the sanctions. So we have exactly the right person to do that. His name is David Peyman. David Peyman is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Counter-Threat Finance and Sanctions. In this capacity, Mr. Peyman leads the Office of Economic Sanctions Policy and Implementation and the Office of Threat Finance Countermeasures. He joined the State Department from BlackRock Inc., where he was Global Head of Sanctions. He obtained the law degree from Harvard Law School and his undergraduate degree from UCLA, where he graduated summa cum laude, received the Chancellor's Service Award, and was the class commencement speaker. He speaks fluent Persian, and although I speak a little Persian myself, we will conduct this interview in English. So I have the honor to invite Mr. Peyman. Well, good morning, sir.
Great to be here with you, Raz.
It's a pleasure to be joined by you. Mr. Peyman, please, if you could just tell us a little bit about your role as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Counter-Threat Finance and Sanctions, and a little bit about the responsibility division between the State Department and the Treasury in the United States concerning sanctions.
Absolutely. First of all, great to be here with all of you today, this morning in beautiful Tel Aviv. So when people say sanctions, they often think about OFAC and the Treasury Department, which we work close with on a daily basis, probably on an hourly basis, my team does. However, sanctions are a foreign policy tool designed to achieve foreign policy goals. And obviously, Secretary Pompeo is the principal foreign policy cabinet member for the president. So my office is responsible for managing 25 sanctions programs for the Secretary, ranging from Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Syria, Russia, and other sanctions programs. And first and foremost, we help create the policy, the architecture, the strategy, the timeline for the implementation of sanctions. So for example, with respect to Iran and the maximum economic pressure campaign, we work very closely with Special Representative Hook to have implemented the maximum pressure campaign and to continue it, and as we're going into 2020, to graduate to a new level of maximum pressure called super maximum pressure, where our sanctions will escalate. The other role we play is to act as an honest broker. We don't want sanctions policies in one region of the world to undermine the president and the secretary's policy priorities in another region of the world. So for example, before we sanctioned PDVSA, which is the Venezuelan state-owned oil company, we wanted to ensure there's price stability and there's supply stability, and it will not negatively impact or harm our sanctions against Iran as we're decreasing Iranian oil by 80%. We did that analysis, we determined we were comfortable sanctioning PDVSA, and I think our assessment has proven to be correct. The third thing we do is, I think, probably one of the most impactful things. The State Department is uniquely positioned to use downgraded, actionable intelligence to engage with parties across the world to determine if there's an opportunity for them to change behavior, to comply with our sanctions before we have to resort to enforcement. We've done so all over the world. Some of them have borne fruit, and actors have changed behavior. Sometimes we do resort to sanctions. One of the most impactful sanctions that I think we've had since 2018 is the sanctions against COSCO. COSCO is the largest ship owner in the world. It's a major Chinese state-owned entity. And that was a sanction action taken by the State Department. And what it proved to the world is that no company is too big to fail. No company is too big not to be sanctioned. And now COSCO, I can confidently say, has one of the strongest sanctions compliance programs in the world, I think, to comply with US sanctions.
And what's the difference between the Treasury and the State Department concerning the sanctions implementation?
Sure. So we've done something unique, actually, to make that distinction a little bit more blurred. So in the past year, we've created an internal sanctions targeting team in the State Department, in my division, that serves much and acts much like OFAC does, where we identify targets and we designate. We do so under specific authorities granted to the Secretary of State. So with respect to Iran, those authorities include going after people and entities who violate our sanctions in energy, oil, petrochemicals, and shipping, which are the two main sectors, I think, for revenue generation for the regime and evasion of sanctions through the use of ships and tankers.
Okay, so there are many views concerning the objective of the maximum pressure policy against Iran. Some would say that it wants to force Iran to accept at least some part of the 12 demands made by Secretary Pompeo. Some would say that the real objective is regime change. I think it was Pompeo who said a few weeks ago that Iran should behave like Norway. So how would you describe the real objective of the sanctions?
So I think the Secretary and Special Representative Hook have been very clear. Our sanctions are intended to deprive this regime of revenue it uses to engage in malign activities across the region and, frankly, against its own people, and to give it a very clear choice to either continue engaging in those malign activities or use whatever money it has left to keep its economy off of life support, but not both. And secondly, obviously, to induce Iran to come back to the negotiating table to address Secretary Pompeo's 12 points. Those 12 points are really 4 key principles. Stop nuclear proliferation and development. Stop development of ballistic missiles whose sole purpose is to carry nuclear warheads. Stop your terrorist activities across the region and the globe, your malign wars in Syria and your support of Houthi rebels in Yemen who are firing Iranian missiles at Saudi population centers, and release all Western hostages. And when Secretary Pompeo refers to Norway, he's basically saying Iran needs to act like any normal country in this world. We don't ask anything more or anything less of the Iranians than we do from any other country in the world.
Okay, so if we assume that the sanctions are aimed at least changing Iran's behavior or policy, some would say that actually the maximum pressure strategy has produced the opposite. I mean, Iran is being more aggressive in the region, especially the Persian Gulf. Iran is being more assertive in continuing its nuclear program. Actually, the recent Israeli defense assessment said that in a matter of a year, Iran will have enough enriched uranium to produce 1 nuclear bomb. So do you have a time frame to meeting American objectives? And do you have plan B in case the objectives of changing Iran's policy are not met?
Raz, I think it's important to note that we reimposed sanctions fully only 14 months ago. And the significant reduction exemptions, which allowed countries like China, South Korea, India, and others to import Iranian oil, only expired less than 8 months ago, or about 8 months ago. And so it's been a very short amount of time. In that short amount of time, we've been, I think, tremendously successful. I was pleased to hear Richard Haass say the other night that despite his earlier predictions that the sanctions will not succeed, they have been enormously successful in their impact. And how do we see that impact? Iran is now telling Iraqi Shia militias that it will no longer fund them, that they have to look for other sources of revenue. The Iranians have cut their defense budget by 29%. Every single year before the reimposition of sanctions, that defense budget went up, including the years before JPOA. For the first time since the JCPOA, since our withdrawal from the JCPOA, the defense budget has been cut. The IRGC budget has been cut by 17%. Hezbollah is aggressively looking for donations across the world to fund its terror activities. What's more is, our sanctions have highlighted the corruption by the Khamenei regime. And it's interesting to note that the anger of the Iranian people is directed toward Khamenei and the regime. For the first time, I think in history, in the 40-year history of this regime, you're hearing sustained, consistent chants of death to the dictator, death to Khamenei. We haven't heard that before. Iran is also more isolated internationally. Since JCPOA, the Europeans have now implemented the dispute resolution mechanism, which, as it plays out, may lead to the snapback of the UN sanctions. So Iran, I think, is more economically isolated. It's certainly more isolated vis-a-vis its own people. It had to slaughter 1,500 people. 1,500 souls were lost because it raised the price of gas. Partly because of economic mismanagement, partly because this regime is giving a break to the IRGC, which controls 50 to 70% of the Iranian economy, while they're putting the burden on the own middle class. So we're seeing fissures between the regime and its people. We're seeing fissures within the regime, and we're seeing the regime more internationally, I think, isolated, and we're seeing a decrease in revenue going to terrorist actors.
But let's assume that 2 years from now, 3 years from now, Iran is facing more troubles inside, more isolated, but the sanctions do not produce a better nuclear deal, and Iran is not ready to go back to negotiations. Will you do what? Continue sanctions, or do you have another plan to?
Well, I'm not going to make policy assumptions or decisions based on a policy assumption. That's obviously a decision for the president to make and for the secretary to make. But again, there is much left to do on our sanctions campaign, and you'll see more sanctions to come. It's been less than a year since the SREs expired. It's been 14 months since reimposition. We're also already seeing great results, and I think our focus is on the target to continue to put economic pressure on this regime. By the way, as only one pillar of a three-pillar strategy with respect to Iran.
Okay, so let's go back to the economic implications in Iran. And look, there is no doubt that the increasing sanctions have hit Iran's economy very bad. Unemployment is high, inflation is very high, they're running out of reserve of foreign exchanges. But there are some signs which might indicate that Iran's economy is becoming more accustomed to the sanctions. For example, the Iranian rial has stabilized a little bit following a collapse in 2018. The global, according to the World Bank, in January 2020, global economic prospects, Iran's economy is forecast to stabilize a little bit by 2021 as the impact of sanctions tapers. One of the, I would say, famous Iranian economists working on Iran, Professor Javad Salehi Isfahani, recently said that the predictions of a quick economic collapse were too optimistic, and there is a misunderstanding of the level of complexity of Iran's economy and how good they are, or how experienced they are with resisting sanctions. So what is your take on that?
So let's look at the totality of the data and the facts as we know it. The IMF has indicated that Iran's economy will contrast by 9%. 9%. I think 10% technically is a depression. However, the 9% figure is based on oil exports of 600,000 barrels per day. We know Iran is not exporting 600,000 barrels per day. So more realistically, the contraction will be likely 10 to 12%. That is a depression. And so, number one. Number two, there is 40% inflation. There's double-digit unemployment. 17 out of 18 Iranian pension funds are in the red, are bankrupt. 17 out of 18. The Iranian regime has resorted to raiding those pension funds and their own sovereign wealth funds. And the fact of the matter is, they have only a couple of options. A, they can print more money, which they're not doing because I think they realize if they do so, that will be an imminent economic collapse. There will be runaway inflation. the rial will fall. It's already fallen by about 50% since May 2018. It'll continue to nosedive. B, they can engage in austerity measures. And we saw the result of those austerity measures. They raised the price of gas. There were mass demonstrations in the streets, and 1,500 people, more than 1,500 people died. So the question is, where will they get their money? The IRGC, which controls roughly 50 to 70% of the Iranian economy, is not taxed. Over 50% of Iran's state-owned enterprises are failing, and they account for 70% of Iran's budget. And so no kind of tricky accounting or crunching numbers can change the reality that the coffers are running dry, and Iran has to make a choice, either to keep its economy off of life support or to continue engaging in malign activity.
Let's talk a little bit about the future. I mean, if I look at the list of sanctions imposed since President Trump's decision to withdraw from the deal, from the JCPOA, we can see a lot of sanctions against the Supreme Leader, against the IRGC, Iran's petrochemical industry, the National Development Fund, the construction sector, Iran's metal industry, and so on and so forth. Some would argue that there isn't that much left to be sanctions. So are we going to see something else, or more of the same in the future?
Great question. So I think you will see more sanctions to come. Not only more sanctions in terms of targets, but strategically expanding the scope of our sanctions. I can't obviously forecast here today what that is going to be, other than to say, if you're an actor currently engaged in the Iranian economy, I'd be extremely, extremely cautious. Even if you think you're engaged in non-sanctionable behavior, tomorrow or next week or next month, you may find yourself engaging in sanctionable conduct, number one. Number two, there is still some sanctions evasion activity. We've done an immense amount of work with partners across the world to ensure that evasion is stopped. And I think that's one of the main misconceptions of our sanctions, that it's unilateral. In fact, our sanctions are multilateral in many respects. Over 100 European companies have withdrawn. More importantly, countries around the world are not only complying, but are proactively helping us implement our sanctions. And so there is more space for cooperation with our partners overseas to ensure there's no more evasion through shipping lanes and vessels, and there is more space to increase the substance and the scope of the sanctions.
By the way, some would describe the sanctions against specific Iranian officials as symbolic. They say that, well, Khamenei doesn't leave Iran, or the commander of the missiles unit doesn't leave Iran, he doesn't have assets outside Iran. So what is the real meaning of those sanctions?
Another good question. So, first of all, it sends a clear message to the Iranian people that we recognize that the unelected regime officials around Khamenei are engaged in corruption, bribery, and mismanagement of their economy, and we're holding them accountable. I think second, it allows us to target fronts they use overseas to have access to funds and financing, and it allows us to better implement our sanctions and, frankly, start looking at family members of those regime officials who are enjoying the stolen money of the Iranian people.
Okay, I see that we're running out of time, but I still have two questions left. One, a few months ago, during the G7 meeting in France, President Trump gave the impression that he's ready to consider $15 billion credit to Iran, or even to issue some extensions to the sanctions if Iran is ready to go back to negotiations and to comply with the JCPOA. Is this still on the table? I mean, if Iran tomorrow morning says we are ready to go back to negotiations, is the US ready to give some waivers, for example?
Let me quote my president on that. No, thank you.
No, thank you. Okay.
We will not let up on our sanctions until Iran starts acting like a normal country?
Okay, well, I still have a lot of questions, but we ran out of time. So let me just thank you for being with us. It was a pleasure.
Raz, thank you very much. Great to be here with you. Great to be here. Thank you. Thank you.